Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Birgitte Fejring. I'm a department director at the Danish Institute for Human Rights on Human Rights and Development. I will be your main pilot through these exciting 2 hours journey that we will embark on together. We have an amazing group of high-level representatives and experts from across the globe who will share their insights on sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic with us. I will just give a very few housekeeping remarks before we start. We have interpretation into Spanish. Para los que quieren escuchar en español, por favor usar el app Interpretify en su teléfono, por favor. I also want to inform you that we will record this webinar. Thereby, we can share it with an even bigger audience. But we will also use the recording for the purpose of elaborating a brief report for broad circulation. We will also, in spite of the limitations during COVID-19, try to make this as interactive as possible. So please make use of the chat function to share remarks and links to relevant materials. And we will also, during this event, post some questions and hope for your active engagement in responding to these. We will come back to all of this later. First, it is my pleasure now to give the virtual floor to Ambassador Morten Jespersen, Denmark's permanent representative to the United Nations, who will welcome us all. Please, Morten, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. With almost 300 registered participants, I'm sure we have representatives from all around the world. If there is a silver lining to the pandemic, it is that it has created now new opportunities to bring so many voices together. However, I, like all of us, deeply hope we will soon be able to meet again face to face. We look forward to that. I'd like to warmly welcome you all to this event. The event takes place on the occasion of the third meeting of the Human Rights Council on Human Rights and the 2030 Agenda, which will take place later today. This Sustainable Recovery Lab is an excellent opportunity for an honest discussion on how we can best place human rights and sustainable development at the core of COVID-19 recovery strategies. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated vulnerabilities and inequalities around the world. Too often, responses has left the most marginalized and vulnerable behind, and too rarely have those that are already furthest behind been reached first. The universal human rights of each individual must be at the heart of our recovery, and efforts to build back better should focus on the many links between states' human rights obligations and the SDGs. That will be, among many, one of Denmark's priorities for our last year as a member of the Human Rights Council. Finally, a warm thank to you, to the Danish Institute for Human Rights, for their hard work on this event, and also to the many co-sponsors. I wish you all a fruitful discussion and hope that you will also join the HRC meeting later today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Morten. And I think it's fair here also to acknowledge the instrumental role that Denmark and Chile and the group of friends has played in putting sustainable development on the agenda of the Human Rights Council. It's now my honor to give this virtual space to the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Mrs. Ilse Brands-Keris, who will provide the opening remarks for our event. Mrs. Brands-Keris, we look very much forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here with all this very deeply engaged community that we are online right now. So, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, I'm pleased to join you today for this panel discussion held in conjunction with the Human Rights Council's third intersessional meeting for dialogue and cooperation on human rights and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And I wish to thank the Danish Institute for Human Rights with the co-sponsors for organizing this important event. A year into the COVID-19 crisis, countries across the globe continue to face alarming levels of pressure on their health and social services. Education and other essential rights, such as water and sanitation, have been severely compromised. Inequalities and poverty have further deepened, with devastating impact on the most vulnerable and marginalized individuals and communities. Many other rights have come under further pressure. The crisis has required taking necessary and proportionate measures to contain the pandemic, but we have also seen the imposition of opportunistic or unintended restrictions on public freedoms, threats on privacy, curtailment of free speech, overreach of emergency powers, and heavy-handed security responses. It is essential that the pandemic is defeated with a sense of humanity that respects human dignity and human rights for all. Importantly, going forward in the recovery process, we have a unique and even a historic opportunity to change course and rebuild more sustainable, human rights-based, socially just and equitable economies and societies as envisioned in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is also what the Secretary General's call to action for human rights asks from all of us: stepped up and joint efforts to squarely place rights at the core of sustainable development. Recovering better will require a new social contract that reduces inequalities and prioritizes the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights for all. Among the first steps to be taken by states should be to reverse the chronic underinvestment in public services. Prioritizing resources to social protection, health, and education is an investment in the future sustainability of our societies. Food, healthcare, education, and social security cannot remain privileges only for those who can afford them. They are and must be seen as basic human rights to which all are entitled without discrimination. This is a defining moment to see economic, social, and cultural rights as legally binding commitments, as essential benchmarks for social policy that are directly related to achieving a speedy and sustainable recovery. To recover better, we will also need a global coordinated effort to secure equal access to safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines that can be distributed to all those who need it. In this context, we must strengthen international cooperation and ensure development assistance and debt relief to reduce inequalities within and between countries and facilitate equitable access to COVID-19 tests, treatments, and vaccines. In building forward better, we need to reset our economies, as well as the global financial and debt architecture, to put the protection of human rights, including the right to development, at the heart of economic policies and choices. The international financial institutions should be encouraged to promote fiscal and policy space for economic, social, and cultural rights as an essential part of economic recovery and economic sustainability. Our office, OHCHR, has stepped up its work on economic and social rights and in support of the implementation of the SDGs through its SURGE initiative. This initiative further strengthened the office's ability to work on human rights-based economics in support of states' effort to build back better. The SURGE team has worked with states to encourage transformative economies, providing advice on the human rights impact of economic reforms and austerity policies, as well as strategies to secure minimum core obligations on economic and social rights and to link them up to national SDGs and development plans. In this context, OHCHR has provided seed funding to 20 field presences to reinforce sectoral analysis and interventions in the context of UN COVID-19 response and recovery, with the view to assessing those most vulnerable and ensuring that no one is left behind. Disaggregated data is crucial to the realization of the international community's promise to leave no one behind. It helps states, civil society, and other partners to better understand and monitor progress for all groups and to develop evidence-based responses, and considers, incorporates, and benefits equitably all segments of society. National human rights institutions are a critical partner in this process. We have also revamped the Universal Human Rights Index in a way to make it easier for states to see the linkages and synergies between specific human rights obligations and SDG commitments. This is aimed to facilitate efforts of states to work comprehensively towards achieving both agendas, keeping in view the current COVID-19 challenges as well. In this context, OHCHR is also continuing its work on human rights indicators and promoting a human rights-based approach to data that expands disaggregation and strengthens collaboration between NHRIs and national statistics offices, including in Albania, Kenya, Kosovo, Liberia, Mexico, the occupied Palestinian territory, the Philippines, and Uganda. The office is also continuing its work on human rights indicators, including for SDG 16 indicators, and to guide the UN socioeconomic response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Also high on the office's agenda is our work on civic space, providing technical assistance to member states and stepping up cooperation with national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, and grassroots movements, including human rights-based COVID-19 response and recovery, and also implementation of the SDGs. The recently launched first ever UN system-wide guidance note on protection and promotion of civic space will be a critical tool for UN country teams to support and strengthen civil society. Furthermore, reports and COVID-19 guidance prepared by OHCHR, international human rights mechanisms, and other partners, such as the Danish Institute, indeed, carry a wealth of information relevant to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and COVID-19 recovery. Similarly, the Office will continue to support efforts to strengthen the engagement of national human rights institutions in implementing and in reporting on the 2030 Agenda, as well as responding to the challenges of the pandemic through human rights approaches. Colleagues, recovering better will require concerted efforts to rebuild trust in the institutions and governance with a renewed commitment to eliminating discrimination, promoting meaningful participation and accountability, and protecting fundamental freedoms. We need to reverse the worrying trend of shrinking civic space and create platforms, including the use of online platforms, for meaningful participation of those affected that will help us to draw on people's unique experiences, resilience, insights, ideas, and visions. In closing, I look forward to listening to your views and practical experiences on how we can make this a reality, achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 on the basis of international human rights standards. So I wish you all a successful meeting and fruitful deliberations, and I look forward to listening to those. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Brancheris, for so clearly setting the frame for what we will discuss today, and for also pointing to how the devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic can also be turned into a unique opportunity to change direction and put human rights at the heart of development efforts, including all the good work that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is doing in that regard. Before we enter into our first panel discussion, I want to ask Mrs. Eva Gramby, the Deputy Executive Director of the Danish Institute for Human Rights, to briefly walk us through what the concept of sustainable recovery based on human rights and SDGs could look like. So, Eva, over to you.
Thank you very much, Birgitte, and also special thanks to Ambassador Jespersen and Assistant Secretary General Keres for your leadership and inspiration in this field. I think you both eloquently explained the why we are making this focus, the urgency, but also the opportunity to leverage existing frameworks. I have a presentation, so I'll ask for the next slide, please. As I said, your explanation of the why has been, I think, already been given in a very eloquent way. Next, please. Next slide. Yes, thank you. My task here is then to try and illustrate how, and I have been given 5 minutes to do so. So I'll try and walk you through. But while you see the full range of human rights and SDGs are indispensable, certain SDG targets have already proven to be of utmost relevance in the immediate context of response and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we at the Institute have actually made an analysis and suggest a compilation of SDG targets that constitutes a blueprint, you could call it, for building back better, as they provide the fundamental building blocks for COVID-19 response and recovery in a manner that leaves no one behind. You can see on the slide those selected targets. There are 29 in total, and they cover all 3 dimensions of sustainability and focus on issues which have been central in human rights statements and reports throughout the pandemic. These include, as also mentioned by Ms. Keres, social protection, food security, violence against women, but also, next please, access to information and institutions, and that's why we put SDG targets under 16 and 17 as cross-cutting. Next slide, please. What is important is, of course, to understand also the connections between then targets and human rights law, as also mentioned by the Assistant Secretary General. Here is just one example on target 1.3. Next, please. And here you can see some of the connections, both to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, but also to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These connections are, of course, important to understand in order to really use the existing frameworks. And you can find those connections on the link that is on the slide. So this is a first step to really understand whether you are a government, an NHRI, an NGO, a company, what are the commitments that are made towards human rights law. Next slide, please. But then back to my initial point, how can one then find practical solutions leveraging existing frameworks for recovery? What you can see here is that we have made a count of relevant recommendations to those targets that we find most relevant from the SDG framework. What are then the relevant human rights recommendations to this? And you can see on the numbers that there is a wealth of guidance in these recommendations from the human rights system. Next, please. Next. You can also here see then another way of looking at the numbers, trying to link it to a particular vulnerable group, in this case, indigenous peoples. But you can actually use the guidance from human rights systems also to make sure that you are taking into account different types of stakeholder groups. And of course, you can also look this at country level. Here you also have a link to the Human Rights Data Explorer, where one can play with the different sorts of recommendations and get a better impression. Next slide, please. But we also acknowledge that, of course, different countries might have different needs and priorities for sustainable recovery. And let me just give one example, and why not from my own country, Denmark. During the COVID-19 pandemic, several countries have experienced a wave of racist-motivated hatred and exclusion, and this pertains particularly to SDG target 10.3. As Denmark's NHRI, National Human Rights Institution, we made a survey during 2020 to see how COVID-19 affected hate speech in Denmark. And the survey documented how minorities are experiencing increased hate speech in public spaces during the pandemic. Examples like shouting, accusations, threatening behavior against people, for example, with Asian descent. Hate speech is not a new phenomenon in Denmark, unfortunately, and the Institute has for a long time recommended to the government to develop a national plan for combating hate crimes. Next, please. And the government has accepted recommendations from the Universal Periodic Review on the matter. Here are examples from Poland and Namibia from 2016. These are 2 out of 24 recommendations on the matter. So this is not new, but the pandemic has made this issue even more clear. It's kind of a magnifying glass. And it is, of course, our hope that the Danish government now prioritize addressing this issue when building back better, for example, in the form of a national action plan. So this is to illustrate that the guidance from the human rights monitoring mechanism can help set Denmark on track, both with regards to implementing their human rights obligations and SDG targets, in this particular case, target 10.3. So, in fact, that we are ending up in a situation post the pandemic where things are becoming better. Next, please. So with this quick run through and my limited time, I've tried to illustrate to you how one can use human rights guidance in the recovery, but also where one should focus in the recovery on those particular SDG targets as we have analyzed should be of particular relevance, the 29 targets. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eva, for making the concept of sustainable recovery more concrete and tangible. We are now moving to our first panel, which will unpack the elements of sustainable recovery from a government and business perspective. And we are very honored to have with us 4 excellent speakers who will share their insights on this matter. First and foremost, we are honored to have with us the Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica, Ministra Maria del Pilar Garrido Gonzalo. Minister, as other countries, we know that Costa Rica is still struggling with the impact of the pandemic. However, can you already share with us which are the priority elements of sustainable recovery that you envisage for Costa Rica, and how are you actively safeguarding human rights and advancing SDG fulfillment when working towards these priorities? Minister, you have the floor. We hope to have the minister with us in a minute. If not, while we sort out the technology, let me move to the other side of the globe, because we also have with us Mrs. Diani Sadiawati, who is the expert staff to the Minister of Planning of Indonesia. So Mrs. Sadiawati, can we ask you please to share with us which are the priorities in Indonesia for sustainable recovery, and how are you building on SDG commitments and human rights obligations? Over to you, Mrs. Sadiawati, please.
Thank you, Birgit. Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon for all of you. So I just would like to start that for your first question about that in the early 2020 that we know that the world faced unexpected non-natural disaster that is surely be a factor contributing to inequality and exclusion. So COVID-19 pandemic has given us a silver lining towards a clearer path on peace and security, development, and human rights. The pandemic also taught us the importance of justice as the pivotal aspect of national development. Developing countries around the world shifted its focus on areas that was once before underestimated or neglected. Human rights interlinks with the development in the context to tackle COVID-19 and to sustain a promising recovery. So for Indonesia, the correlation between the SDGs commitment and human rights are very, very close. The world is aware how abrupt the changes are in 2020 because of the COVID-19. This is also caused a shift on our national priority under our annual work plan 2020 and in our national medium-term plan 2020-2024. During this time, SDGs play a role as universal value of people and also as reminder of and under the principle of no one left behind. And it is our commitment to uphold human rights. Nevertheless, responding to the pandemic sets priority policies on the health sector to give extra protection for vulnerable groups. The social protection program is given for poor population, varied from conditional cash transfer, around 2.3 billion US dollar for 9 million beneficiaries, cash transfer for workers whose income is less than 5 million rupiah or 2.2 million US dollar for 15.7 million workers. And not only that, we also subsidize the electrical for 4.3 billion US dollar for 31.2 million households. And also we give staple coupon card for 1.9 million beneficiaries. So this is in line, of course, with the goal 10 of the SDGs with regard to reduce inequalities. Under the health sector, the government subsidized hospital bills for 4.6 billion US dollar and allowance for paramedics. I think we know that like the other countries that the paramedics is very affected for the COVID-19, how that they handle the COVID-19 patient. And the government give the allowance for the paramedics for 40 million US dollar. So during this pandemic, we know that adjustment is needed. Therefore, on March 2020, we enacted law number 2 year 2020 regarding monetary state policy and financial system stability to respond to COVID-19. And this law is used as the basis to implement situational financial policies. So relating to goal 16.10, that is to ensure public access to information with regard to COVID-19, it is important for us to deliver accurate and transparent information to the public to avoid false information. In addition, COVID-19 patients' data on their well-being are kept confidential as part of the right to privacy. The government, through National COVID-19 Task Force, regularly updates pandemic situations through mass media. So this includes the number of positive rates, death rate, and current policies from the government. Lastly, informal workers are affected also by the pandemic by losing daily income. That is relevant with goal 8 of the SDGs, especially for the target 8.8, that is protect labor rights and promote a safe and secure work environment for all workers, especially migrant workers, women migrant workers, and those who working in hazardous work. So considering that informal workers suffers the most by COVID-19 impact, our president gives its special attention to small medium enterprises by supporting their business through cash transfer mechanism. One of the first batch that the government allocates 1.5 billion US dollar for 12 million small medium enterprise. And the president also continued to allocate $511 million for 3 million small medium enterprise. So this week marks a progress on Indonesia vaccine situation, where the National Food and Drug Agency has given authorized permission on Sinovac vaccine to be used. Yesterday, our president, along with the head of Indonesian Doctor Association and also with the high-level official, has already got a vaccine, and we prioritize also the frontline workers such as doctors, paramedics, soldiers, and police officers. Soon, elders will receive vaccine in March 2021. Currently, the first batch of vaccine will be delivered for those in the range of 18 until 59 years of age. We also made sure that these vaccines are halal, because we mostly Islamic religious, and certified from our Indonesian Muslim Council. Since from the beginning of clinical trial, the Indonesian Muslim Council worked together with the COVID-19 National Task Force. I think that's the first question that I can try to answer, Bridget. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Satyawati, for this very comprehensive account of how Indonesia is responding to the pandemic with a focus on vulnerable groups, and how you're linking it to human rights and SDGs, and also encouraging to hear that vaccine efforts are now advancing in Indonesia. While we are still trying to overcome the problems to get a minister from Costa Rica online for our event, perhaps I will turn to the other two panelists in this segment, because we hear from Indonesia, and I think the pandemic has certainly confirmed the central role of governments and strong, inclusive and democratic institutions to counter the effects of the pandemic. But so has the pandemic also confirmed the key role and contribution of businesses. And I'm very happy that we have with us Mr. Crispin Conroy, who is the representative director of the International Chamber of Commerce in Geneva, and also the ICC permanent observer to the United Nations in Geneva. Mr. Conroy, we know that businesses are important in realizing the SDGs in terms of job creation, sustainable production, finance, etc., but also have a very important role in complying with international labor standards and by assessing and addressing adverse human rights impacts throughout their supply chains in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So from your perspective, how can businesses more progressively align their role in sustainable recovery with human rights and the SDGs?
Thank you very much. And I'd like just firstly to thank the Danish Institute for Human Rights for including ICC today, but also through you, Camille, pleased to thank the World Benchmarking Alliance, specifically your colleague Ryan in New York, for bringing our attention to this initiative. And in that context, thank you to the Danish and Chilean governments, especially to the Chilean government. I was ambassador of Australia in Chile for many years, so I have Chile has a special place in my heart. So muchas gracias a ustedes. I have a very short time to respond, I know, but I think it is important to introduce very briefly the International Chamber of Commerce, because I think it's important to help contextualize our interest in this initiative, and also our interest in working with our business members to engage with governments and other stakeholders to better implement the SDGs within that overarching human rights framework. And our name is the International Chamber of Commerce, but we're not really a chamber in the traditional sense of bringing businesses together to do business. We're not a lobby group either. We don't represent any specific business sector. ICC was formed 100 years ago in the aftermath of the First World War by a group of entrepreneurs and philanthropists who wanted to find ways for the business community to help support the rebuilding of communities and the recovery from the horrors of war. We now represent over 45 million companies worldwide in over 100 countries. So we are the global business organization. Our headquarters is in Paris, and we're the only business organization with permanent representative status, observer status, sorry, to the United Nations. And for this reason, we have an office in New York and now in Geneva. The Geneva mission, which I head, was established 2 years ago. And when our Secretary General wrote to the UN Secretary General announcing the opening of the office, he put it very much in the context of really the business looking at how we could identify ways to contribute better or more progressively, if you like, to the implementation of the SDGs. And we see this very much as being within the human rights framework. And this is reflected in the focus that we have in Geneva on the UN Guiding Principles and the UNGP 10-year plus initiative. In other words, where we go from now with the UNGPs. In terms of business alignment with human rights and the SDGs in the context of a sustainable recovery, many of our individual business members, some of them multinationals who will be well known to you all, are already engaged. Many believe that alignment, especially as we all work to build back in a more sustainable and resilient way with human rights principles and with the SDGs, is a strategic imperative. In other words, that it's not just the right thing to do, but it also makes good sense for businesses. Having said this, more broadly, such engagement and alignment is patchy. Many businesses still don't see this as part of their core business, nor are they aware of the strong business case. In this context, where we need to mainstream and to scale business alignment, both geographically and with a range of different companies, from large to small to micro, ICC, with its broad network, its geographic coverage, and its convening power, has a very important role to play. Let me give you a couple of examples of what we're doing already. You can see more on the ICC website, and I'm very happy to engage offline with participants who might be interested in learning more about what we're doing or to partner with us. One important initiative, I think, is the Icc Sma Climate Hub, which was launched mid last year to assist SMEs worldwide to make climate commitments and to implement these commitments through the provision of specific tools and guidelines. We've also engaged in the hub with a number of multinational companies, so from the other end, so to speak, so that those multinationals can assist SMEs and micro organizations within their supply chains to comply with their climate commitments. We also collaborated recently with the International Trade Center, the W20 and UPS, on a report on MSME women entrepreneurs in the context of COVID and a sustainable recovery. We're now working with these partners to implement the report findings and to support women entrepreneurs in developing and transition economies, in particular in the context of the recovery process. In the context of the previous speaker, it's also might be interesting to look at ICC's global program called Save Our SMEs, recognizing the importance that SMEs have in terms of providing employment, building economic activity as we move forward. I mentioned ICC's focus on business and human rights. In addition to organising regional events with businesses in our network on the implementation of the guiding principles in the context of the 10-year plus initiative that I also mentioned, we're also coordinating discussions with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development and the Business and Human Rights Centre of the Geneva University, most recently in December on Human Rights Day, on human rights due diligence in global supply chains and how we can do better. Another area of ICC focus that's relevant is our promotion of the circular economy, and I'm happy to respond to questions on this issue or share more material offline. Also, another very important area that doesn't get much airtime, I think, is how we can better ensure coherence between the international trading system, that is the WTO, and the SDG agenda. And that's on issues like fisheries subsidies, for example, so SDG 14.6, and also the recently launched structured discussions. so bringing on trade and environmental sustainability, and our Secretary General attended that launch. Just in conclusion, let me make a suggestion that I think this is a fantastic initiative. I'm very happy to participate, as I said, but I'd like to make this a starting point. So, Brigitte, if in the future we can maybe delve down a bit deeper with some of our company members and get down to, and also look for sharing of experience and suggestions, I'd be very interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much for putting the alignment with SDGs and human rights as a strategic imperative for the business community, and the need to scale up the somewhat patchy alignment so far. I'm also very happy that you brought in explicitly the perspective on climate change, which I think should be part of what we are discussing here today. And finally, your invitation to reach out and to take this further, both as an alliance, but also perhaps in a more bilateral manner. And I saw my colleagues here at DHR and immediately noting your reference to target 14B on small-scale fishes and fish subsidies, which is something that we also work on here. So I'm sure many of us will take this invitation to reach out and continue. You already mentioned the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we now also have with us Mrs. Camille Lepors, who is the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark lead. And the World Benchmark Alliance, you have recently undertaken a study of how 230 companies have assessed and addressed human rights and SDG-related issues in the COVID-19 context. Can you very briefly summarize the findings and recommendations that came out of this study?
Thank you very much. Excellencies and friends, good morning or afternoon. Many thanks to the Danish Institute for Human Rights, to Chile, Denmark, and other partners for helping organize today's discussion. With the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, we have been assessing some of the largest global companies on their human rights performance for the last 4 years. And in light of the coronavirus pandemic, last year we decided to conduct an additional study into these companies' responses to the COVID-19 crisis, more specifically, as Brigitte just mentioned. The full study will be published on the 1st of February, but I'm pleased to be able to share some key findings with you today. So with the study, we've seen some examples of good practices where businesses took steps to ensure that the rights of their workers were respected during the pandemic. More than 60% of the companies assessed described steps taken to ensure the health and safety of their workers. However, in spite of these positive examples, most companies actually failed to demonstrate that their response to the pandemic was sufficient to limit negative impacts on workers and ensure that their rights were respected, especially in supply chains. Less than half of the companies assessed described how they provide financial support for workers who are temporarily prevented from working, and only 4% of the companies we looked at indicated that they consulted with worker representatives, communities, and vulnerable groups in their own operations when identifying and assessing COVID-19 related human rights risks and impacts. The crisis, it's been said already, has laid bare the weaknesses of the current system, and we've seen it through the study, in which vulnerable individuals and groups routinely pay the heavy price inside businesses and in the shadows of their often long and complex supply chains. As the UN Human Rights Council Intersessional on SDGs and Human Rights will convene shortly, these findings very clearly and strongly emphasize the crucial importance of social justice, equality and inclusion, and the labor rights and human rights that underpin them in the achievement of a sustainable recovery. The Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, can only be achieved if no one is left behind, and respect for human rights by state and non-state actors is absolutely essential in ensuring that this is the case. I'm very grateful to be given the opportunity to ask a question to Mr. Conroy, representing the International Chamber of Commerce. So with a view to finding solutions jointly to move forward, I'd like to ask the following. Based on the ICC's expertise and work with businesses worldwide, what do you see as the role the private sector should play in ensuring that no one, and particularly vulnerable workers and communities across supply chains, is left behind as the international community works towards achieving the SDGs? Thank you.
Thank you, Camille, very much. And it's good to be sharing this virtual panel with you. I've participated in quite a few events with some of your colleagues, and including discussing some of your reports and regional events too. And I think it's very important in this context, when we're discussing challenging issues like this, that we go out of our comfort zone a little bit, and also we look to build alliances that may not be perhaps traditional partners or the most comfortable. And I'll talk about that a little bit, I guess, in my response. But I think I gave a flavour of it in the response to the first question, that I think within ICC's very DNA from the beginning of its creation in 1919, there has been and still is a focus on not leaving people behind, any people. Our Secretary General, John Denton, who joined the organisation about 3 years ago, I think, has stated many times that ICC has as its guiding purpose to make trade work for everyone, everywhere, leaving no one behind. That was the purpose he developed on joining the organisation, and reflecting the founders' original spirit. But I think it's become even more a focus of what we're doing in the context of the current pandemic and the need to build towards a sustainable and resilient recovery. I'd like to point you to the ICC Centenary Declaration of May 2019, just because that, as I said, reaffirms the vision of our founders on the need for ICC to play a role in helping solve global challenges. And it also refreshes that vision, but with the special focus on inequality. In the context of our contribution to a sustainable and resilient recovery, ICC, as I said, has been really focusing on the need to ensure that the most vulnerable are not left behind. And let me give you a few examples. There are many, so I'm happy to share them with you, Camille, or the others offline. First, and I think the Assistant Secretary General, Keris, mentioned the importance of this, that early in the pandemic, ICC led the call against the use of trade measures to hinder access to essential medical and food supplies to the most vulnerable. And more recently, we've been at the forefront of those expressing concerns about the so-called vaccine nationalism, including through a joint message from the International Trade Union Council and Global Citizen. I think that's a start of quite an impactful alliance of workers, civil society, and business, sort of highlighting the need to focus on the most vulnerable. We're also leading the voices on the need to ensure equitable access to vaccines, especially for the most vulnerable communities. We are on the ACT Accelerator board, the only business organisation to be on the board, and we've been calling very strongly for increased support from countries to the COVAX facility. But in addition, we're organising with the WHO later this month a special roundtable with leading businesses globally, especially I have to say those that have done the best in recent months, to promote actually private sector contributions to COVAX. Also with International Trade Union Council and Global Citizen, I mentioned the alliance, we've made also a particular call in relation to debt relief for the most vulnerable countries, as they try to focus their limited resources on combating the pandemic. ICC has also recently established a series of centres for entrepreneurship, and this in the context of the need to help countries create employment as they try to build back in a more sustainable way, with the first in Beirut. And that's of particular importance to that country as it seeks to rebuild through small business activity. We also recently established a digitalization program for SMEs in Southern Saharan Africa. And just to conclude, I can see, Brigitte, you're looking as though you want someone else to speak, that ICC and UNICEF have made quite a detailed statement, and I'm happy to share that as well, on the need to support the most vulnerable. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crispin. And you're absolutely right. We are about to wrap up this panel, and unfortunately, we have not been able to get to the minister. But I'm sure that we will have something to share afterwards on the very good practice and policies that we have observed from Costa Rica. So at least for the Spanish speakers, I can recommend that you take a look at the website of the ministry, which is a very encouraging example of accountability and transparency in COVID-19 recovery measures. Before we wrap up, I want to very briefly go back to you, Mrs. Sadiawati from Indonesia, just to hear. We heard a lot about vulnerable groups, vulnerable workers, communities, etc. Just to very briefly hear from you how in Indonesia you have worked to overcome these and make these part of the sustainable recovery process. Just for 2 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. So in handling the COVID-19, of course, that no one size fits for all policy. So, of course, that every country has their own policy, considering the various aspects like fiscal capacity, social condition, and also the geographical location. So, with regard to face the pandemic COVID, so we still face like a data. Because the data, we currently work to integrate the scattered data that are cross-ministerial in Indonesia, like Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Affairs, and also the Ministry of Home Affairs, how to accelerate the one data policy. I think this is a very important for us that the data will be the very important, how to ensure that the right person to get the, for example, like social protection. So with regard to how we reinforce the partnership with the private sector, and also with the how that the people who are poor and vulnerable. So the issue of inequality is even for us more challenging, considering our country is very big, and therefore, we note that the development on the outer region should be accelerated. That strategy is also reflected on our National Development Plan agenda. So, with regard to the how that we progress to the formulate to our National Action Plan, and how that we focus on the vulnerable people. So it's also related with the how did our commitment for a sustainable recovery will not move forward without economic transformation. So we strive to redesign our Indonesia economic transformation, which adapt to the new normal trends, so that the nation productivity can continue to increase in the inclusive and sustainable manner, that we can hopefully that we can catch up to become a developed country before 2045. So with regard to the, we know that with regard to the economic transformation, that also related with our how we face the pandemic COVID-19. So we also try to relate with the how that the green recovery and also an inclusive and sustainable green economy will be our focus for the next development plan. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think your focus on inequality is a perfect segue to the next panel, where we will have different rights holder perspectives on what does sustainable recovery mean for them. And I think we can already conclude that there's no sustainable recovery without addressing the issue of inequalities. And thank you also for again raising the issue of data and the need for disaggregated data. We are now moving towards our first interactive segment. And the idea here is that you, dear participants from across the world, will make your contribution to shaping the concept of sustainable recovery. You will see in the chat that a link is appearing. And when you follow that link, you will see 2 questions that we ask you to reflect on and respond to. Question 1 is, what should be the core elements of sustainable recovery? And the following question is, how do we bring governments, businesses, communities, and citizens together in partnerships for sustainable recovery? How do we build that coherence and those concerted efforts that have already been mentioned by previous speakers? So please put in there your best and brightest ideas, reflections, good practices, and other elements that can help people across the globe build sustainable recovery strategies for their countries and communities. And while you have 5 minutes to share your ideas and input through the link, we will share a message that the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Mr. Olivier de Schutter, has forwarded to us. He was unfortunately not able to attend in person, but he has recorded a message for us. Mr. de Schutter presented his report on just transition in economic recovery, eradicating poverty within planetary boundaries. This report he presented at the 75th session of the General Assembly in October 2020. The report makes 3 claims, which we will now hear Mr. de Schutter explain to us. Speaker.
On the reduction of inequalities. The first claim is that we need to focus our efforts on the reduction of inequalities. The reason for this is very simple. If we do not reduce inequalities, there will be major tensions between poverty reduction on the one hand and the reduction of our ecological footprint, our pressure on the environment on the other hand. And that is because poverty reduction, if it depends on continued economic growth, on continued wealth creation, shall have major impacts on the environment. To reduce that tension, we need to ensure that any incremental wealth creation, any economic growth benefits first the poorest within society and is fairly redistributed across different groups in society. And so reducing inequalities is absolutely key to reduce this tension between poverty eradication and reducing our ecological footprints. The second message of the report is that in order to achieve this, we should choose in different sectors of the economy measures that have 3 impacts: that reduce our ecological footprint, that create employment and particularly create job opportunities for people with low levels of qualification, and thirdly, measures that make goods and services essential for a decent life affordable for low-income households. And these are measures which I call triple dividend measures, or measures that fulfill three duties. And we can identify such measures in sectors such as mobility, energy, construction, or food and agriculture. Let me give just two examples. If we invest in infrastructures for public transport, we reduce the need for individual cars, and that means reducing pollution from individual cars and ensuring that mobility is affordable for low-income households. And at the same time, since creating such infrastructures requires employment, we create job opportunities for people who are without employment for the moment. A second example is the insulation of buildings. If you retrofit buildings in order to insulate them better, not only do you create employment in the construction sector, but you also reduce the environmental impacts of the heating of buildings, and you ensure that the energy bills of families living in these better insulated buildings will be reduced as a result. So these are triple dividend measures that the report lists, identifies in order to guide governmental action. Thirdly and finally, it's important also to ask the question, who shall finance this economic recovery? Where shall the money come from? In recent years, over the past 30, 40 years, the tax burden has shifted from wealthy individuals and corporations to low-income households and to labor. And we need to change this. We need to move to a system in which corporations shall pay their fair contribution to the provision of public services, and in which taxation systems will be made more progressive, whereas as a result of tax competition and the absence of sufficient international cooperation in the area of taxation, we have seen the opposite trends in recent years. And so the third message of the report is that we should ensure that the recovery is also fair, considering how it shall be financed. I'm convinced that now is also a time of opportunities as governments reinvest in the economy and guide the economy to rebuild it. We can solve this complex equation between poverty eradication and the ecological transition. And I very much welcome the efforts of all those around the table to broaden our political imagination to achieve this. Many thanks, and I look forward to our future collaboration.
We thank Olivier de Schutter for his message based on his report to the General Assembly. I would recommend those of you who have not read it yet to have a look into it. It's really interesting and brings together the three dimensions of sustainable development: the social, economic, and the environmental or climate related. We have received some responses from participants, and while we will not have time to go into details with all of these, let me just go through some of the responses we received to question 1, what should be the core elements of sustainable recovery? There's no doubt that at this community, we talk about putting human rights at the very center. Also, the issue of climate justice and planetary boundaries that the Special Rapporteur just spoke about also comes out very strongly. One participant is mentioning the need for fiscal policies that build societies where nobody is left behind, and the need for partnerships, alliances, and concerted efforts is mentioned again and again, including through, if we go to the next question, through dialogue, joint initiatives. One participant is mentioning the central role of the state in actually calling or convening such dialogues. The role of civil society is mentioned by many participants, including the role of national human rights institutions who can use their mandate to make sure that both human rights and sustainable development is at the core of of recovery measures in a manner that leaves no one behind. The specific challenge of enhancing protection of human rights defenders is mentioned and very, very important. And finally, in the context of the role of business and the patchy alignment we heard about in the previous segment, one of the participants is mentioning the need for a binding treaty on business and human rights in order to make the strategic imperative into a more legal imperative. But unfortunately, we don't have time to go into details with all the input. We will now have to move to the next segment. But as I mentioned before, we will share a brief report where we will also highlight the input from participants. So be prepared, because there will be 2 more interactive segments later in the program. I think the input we have received now is an important segue to the next panel, which will talk about how do we ensure that no one is left behind in sustainable recovery. And I'm very happy to now hand over the moderation to Ignacio Seitz, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights based in New York. So I apologize for you having to start the day so early, Ignacio. Over to you.
Thank you, Birgitta. Not at all a problem. Thank you to the Danish Institute and to all the organizers of this wonderful event. I am thrilled to be introducing this segment where we're going to be exploring the challenges for sustainable recovery from the perspective of civil society organizations and networks, which have been deeply engaged in the SDG process in the last 5 and more years. And these are organizations which represent some of the communities most affected by the current crisis and most left behind in responses to it. We are going to hear from Joan Carling, who is co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development, from Shehnaz Koymaz, who is coordinator of the Women's Major Group for Sustainable Development, and from Mandeep Tiwana, who is Chief Programs Officer at the Global Civil Society Alliance, Civicus. We have 2 overarching questions for this session. The first question will be focused on the vision and concept of sustainable recovery. So we'll be asking, what does a sustainable and just recovery look like from the perspective of the rights holders who are most affected by the intersecting crises which are facing us? And note that I've added the word just here to the concept of sustainable recovery. And that's because if there's one fundamental shift that a human rights perspective brings, it's in recognizing that development is a matter of justice. It's not a matter of charity or good intentions. This pandemic has exposed the many injustices underlying our economic, social, political order. And a truly sustainable and rights-based recovery is one that addresses these systemic injustices at their root. Now, the second question that we will be exploring as a panel is more about the strategies and the pathways for getting to that vision of sustainable recovery. What needs to happen for the SDG process to be a more effective vehicle for advancing a just, sustainable, and rights-based recovery? So we're going to be looking at what obstacles civil society groups are encountering as they attempt to leverage these SDG and human rights processes in this context and how those obstacles can be overcome. Now, these questions are vast and our time is very limited. So I'm going to dive straight in, and panelists, you know that we have just 3 minutes for our responses. We're not in the same room together, so it won't be as easy for me to warn you that your time is coming up. So forgive me in advance if I'm a little bit assertive in jumping in if we're straying beyond those 3 minutes. But let me not lose any more time and go to Joan first. Joan, what does a sustainable and just recovery look like from the perspective of Indigenous peoples and the Indigenous peoples advocates? Joan, you're muted, I think.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, let me first start by saying that the highest death toll and cases of COVID is unfortunately among indigenous peoples in the US per capita. In the whole world, we have the highest level of death and cases of COVID, and that already demonstrates the underlying inequality and discrimination and of indigenous peoples. So if we're talking about the aspirations of indigenous peoples for a just recovery, there are several urgent steps that are needed to address this situation. First is for indigenous communities to immediately have access to health services, so to prevent the further spread, and also to be provided with and the vaccine, but also to have food security and sustainable livelihoods in their communities. And the more important thing now is building the strong resilience of indigenous peoples to this pandemic. And one of the key aspirations of indigenous peoples around this is to ensure the protection and security of indigenous peoples' lands, territories, and resources from land grabbing and destruction. Because under the COVID, we've seen that this has been taken advantage of states and the private sector in terms of expropriating and taking away the lands of indigenous peoples while we are in lockdown. And that exacerbates further the injustice and inequality in the time of COVID. Second is that indigenous peoples want that the recognition and acknowledgement and protection of the way we are protecting protecting biodiversity and in pursuing sustainable resource management systems, and this should be recognized, and that and the labeling of indigenous peoples as anti-development should be stopped, because this is the biggest contribution we are making, and yet we are being labeled as anti-development. So finally, I just want to say that the biggest, of course, aspiration of indigenous peoples is first the full recognition of our rights, collective rights, and in order to do this, we need to transform, as everybody has mentioned, the economic and political system to dismantle the barriers to achieve equality, non-discrimination, and justice.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joan. Let me move to Shehnaz. What does a gender-just sustainable recovery look like? Shehnaz, you're also muted.
Yes, is it better? Hopefully. Many thanks. We're very happy to be able to share the voices and the words of our constituency here today. And I think a gender-just recovery would also mean a transformative recovery for all of us. And I'm actually very happy to have been hearing this, that COVID needs to be kind of a wake-up call for all of us to actually change our ways, change the systems of oppression we live in. So this transformative recovery, as many have said, needs to begin with those that are left most behind. We're in intersecting crises, you know, they're not created, but mostly exacerbated and made visible with COVID. So as women and girls are in all our diversities in the front lines of this new crisis, these intersecting crises, exponential increase in unpaid care work, loss of employment and livelihoods, rise in violence that we've seen throughout the world, especially gender-based and domestic violence, our lives at risk as caregivers and healthcare workers, and in addition, as the civil society, the rise of authoritarian measures taken by governments, as well as power grabs by political leaders, they threaten the civil society space in the social justice movement. We need no less than transformation of all systems of oppression, including patriarchy, neoliberal capitalism, and militarism, to recover in a transformative and just manner, and we must work collectively for this purpose. And to be able to create and implement resourced, human rights-based, gender-responsive COVID-19 recovery plans, as said, we need to target the most marginalized, but also make sure those most marginalized and women and girls in all their diversities are in the decision-making and implementation and review of, and follow-up of these plans and recoveries. We need a whole government approach because our issues are very much interconnected and holistic. Like the human rights and like our lives, they're indivisible. Traditional siloed approaches do not work. We need to make sure that feminist organizations, women's organizations are included at all levels. We need to remember that states are the ones that are mandated to be responsible under the human rights mechanisms at this point currently. So we need to make sure that states hold non-state actors accountable for their human rights violations, including against environmental and women human rights defenders. We need a more just and equitable financial order, as mentioned by the special rapporteur. We need overall a macro transformation in our systems that prioritizes the pillars of the sustainable development most left behind, an economy based on care, not just the exercise, but also the enjoyment of our human rights by all and based on sustainability. Many thanks.
Thank you, Shehnaz. Perfectly timed to 3 minutes. Mandeep, let me turn to you. Civicus has been doing some really important work monitoring civil society trends in this context. What do you see, what does Civicus see as the key elements of a sustainable and just recovery?
Ignacio, good to see you again, and many thanks to the Danish Institute of Human Rights for hosting this conversation. What I'm going to be saying today is going to reflect a lot what Shehnaz and Joanne have already said, but I just wanted to just share that, you know, every year Civicus produces a State of Civil Society report. And in producing this report, we look at a broad range of perspectives from civil society activists and organizations on the ground that are serving communities. And last year, when we put this report together, we asked them what they think is going to be a just recovery. And they told us 5 big elements of what can drive this recovery. And I wanted to share these with our audience today. So the first element of this is to rethink how our economies are structured. We are living in a time of exacerbating and increasing inequality. You know, on one hand, we have billionaire wealth increasing, and on the other hand, we have global hunger increasing. You know, so this is something that I think we all need to reflect upon. We have huge amounts of spending on military infrastructures, yet we have people who don't have access to basic things like healthcare or clean water. So we need greater state intervention into ensuring that basic needs of people are met, and our economic discourses are focusing more on privatization and deregulation of business activities, whereas we need states to take responsibility for the services for which they collect direct and indirect taxes from people. So that's really, really important. And, you know, we need to start thinking about important things such as state infrastructure for healthcare. If anything, the pandemic has shown us that's absolutely critical, and also to think about more innovative ways such as universal basic incomes that allow, you know, a basic standard of living for everyone. The second point I wanted to reinforce, and which speaks to something that Joanne raised, was we need to put the needs of the excluded first. The pandemic has really accelerated the fissures in our societies, and people who were disadvantaged earlier have felt the real brunt of the pandemic, whether it's disadvantaged minorities, whether it's LGBTQI communities, whether it's women who have faced the brunt of domestic violence, whether it's impoverished populations and daily wage laborers and workers who have lost their jobs. So we really need to ensure that in our pandemic recovery puts the needs of those excluded first, those who are facing the real brunt of all the, you know, the global challenges at the moment. We are facing a economic recession of epic proportions, so they need to be put first. We need to focus on social protection flows. We need to stay away from austerity policies that will enrich those who are at the top of the economic ladder. and really focus on those whose needs are critical. And this also includes refugee populations, indigenous peoples populations, disadvantaged minorities in various countries. The third point that we heard was we need to have a refocusing on climate justice and protection of biodiversity. Right-wing populism and authoritarian leaders have very cleverly made alliances with profiteering businesses, and especially within the fossil fuel industry. And this has led to catastrophic consequences, as we've seen fires raging from the Amazon to Australia, and huge amounts of loss of biodiversity, which is going to have huge consequences for future generations. So we really need to recenter back on policies that promote clean energy, clean fuel, and power a better future for our children. The fourth point that we heard was about a focus on civic freedoms, a focus on democratic values. Our political leaders have made life and death decisions. People need to know the basis on which these decisions are being made, on basis on which the decision makers are acting, and it's important for people to be able to shape the decisions that are being made. Yet we find that in a large part of the world, civic freedoms, democratic values are actually eroding, and those who are powerful are able to shape decisions of states to their advantage. So it's really important that we focus on this aspect. We allow civil society, we allow people to influence the decisions that impact their lives, and that's going to be critical going forward. And to strengthen democratic institutions, to strengthen inclusive governance is absolutely critical here. And the last point that we really want to focus on is we really need a recentering on people-centered multilateralism. The last few years have seen almost an erosion of multilateral values, an erosion of internationalism. And here, and a pandemic has actually brought the realization of that more importantly to us, because it's gone across borders. And here we really need to strengthen our international institutions. We need to ensure that they are not only well-resourced, but also that they are able to act independently in the best interests of people across the world. And that's really absolutely critical. And I really want to emphasize one point on multilateralism. And before concluding, there is a tendency for multilateralism to be selfishly used by some states who want multilateralism for trade policies or economic policies. But multilateralism is about human rights too. And it's important that multilateralism should be seen in holistic ways, and where the whole, the Agenda 2030 discourse or the universal human rights discourse should be taken together, and multilateralism needs to support that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mandeep, and thank you all three for really rich contributions in very limited time. I'm struck by the commonalities between what you're all saying, and I think at least three key threads are emerging here. That any vision of sustainable and just recovery has to be a holistic vision. In other words, we can't cherry pick which SDG goals or which human rights we're going to prioritize. We have to recognize the indivisibility of rights and the interdependence of injustices that this crisis has really laid bare. Secondly, that it has to be transformational. All three of you used the term transformational recovery, not technocratic, not just reformist, not just tinkering with individual policy shifts. It's really about addressing the systemic and structural flaws in our economy, in how we value care, how we value resources, how we value the planet. And thirdly, I'm struck by the need for a vision of recovery that is inclusive in all the ways that you all described. So I think this has been a powerful reality check as well, because very often, to speak frankly, in intergovernmental circles, there tends to be a limited grounding to earth, and I think what we're hearing here is that the realities that the COVID pandemic has exacerbated are very different sometimes from those which inform the discussions in more formal contexts. So let me move to the second to the second question, and I think Mandeep's final comments have kind of segued into the how, into the strategies and pathways for getting there. So what needs to happen for the SDG process to be a more effective vehicle for advancing this vision? I think all of us have been constructively engaged in this process because we believe it's important, but all of us have been equally frustrated and aware of the limitations of that process. So, you know, what can be done at this critical juncture to overcome some of the obstacles that we've encountered as civil society organizations, and to really meaningfully leverage the SDG process to advance that more holistic, transformative, and inclusive vision of recovery? Let me start with Shehnaz first.
Thank you. Allow me to start with a very concrete proposal, because it's very timely that we're talking about this here. As we've said that we need a transformative, holistic, integrated approach, inclusive approach, reflected at all points and all levels of Agenda 2030 work. And this includes this monitoring and review. We're at a crucial time when an HLPF review process will be starting within the United Nations, within the member states soon. And we believe that this can give us an opportunity to achieve an HLPF that can actually deliver both for SDGs and the human rights with a tighter connection. So it's a good opportunity we have right now to change HLPF from a passive reporting place to actually an active, transformating, rebuilding stage that we need for this decade of action. As the Women's Major Group, we're in the preparation of a concrete proposal for this HLPF review, and we'll be launching it next week. We'd be happy to share it. We'll, of course, widely distribute, but we'd be happy to share it with anyone interested. So we want a greater emphasis, greater connections of the Agenda 2030 and the HLPF to the local, national, regional levels and all of the stakeholders. So coming back to what you've said, making sure that there's a reality check coming with it. We believe that it is very crucial. It has been one of our priorities that human rights mechanisms and the SDGs work needs to talk very much more. It's one of our priorities for this year. So it's very timely that we are talking about this in such a big dialogue with multilateral and many stakeholders together here. And building upon Mandeep's note on people-centered multilateralism, this is kind of a warning because we're coming from, of course, the feminist movement on gender equality and working on LGBTI rights with our colleagues in the LGBTI movement. But we do see a threat to the multilateral system, but also to our human rights. Although gender equality and LGBT rights are at the forefront of this attack right now, this pushback, we know from experience, will be spreading to all areas of human rights throughout the time. And although they look very national in each of their contexts, we know that these attacks are actually deeply and internationally connected. And unfortunately, they're encroaching on the multilateral spaces, sometimes using the multilateral system itself, many times, to take away from the system and dismantle it by themselves. So coming from the fronts of that attack, I think we can say that we need member states and the institutions, multilateral institutions themselves, to stand in solidarity with the civil society, feminist movement, LGBTI movements, and all rights movements to make sure to protect and progress the standards and institutions we've built in the last decades and the progressive understanding we have of human rights at all levels, including Agenda 2030. So we need to recommit to multilateral governance and global solidarity.
Thank you so much, Shehnaz. Joan, does that resonate with the proposals and ideas that you and indigenous peoples activists are bringing forward around the SDGs? Just unmute yourself again, Joan.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to add some key points I think that's urgently needed now. One is the policy coherence. There's really a need for policy coherence in the implementation of the 3 dimensions of the SDGs, the environmental, economic, and social. And what I've seen now, for example, in the recovery plans, it's again the economic growth under business as usual, and there's even an excuses made that we can sacrifice the environment to meet the economic growth targets. And so if we don't measure economic growth targets in relation to its impact to human rights, in relation to its impact to the environment and sustainability, we will not reach the SDGs for sure. Second point is that we need an integrated approach and mechanisms within the UN system itself. Because the way the UN is now dealing with the SDGs is still in silos. It's still siloed, like you have that we cannot discuss human rights in the context of SDGs because that is done in Geneva. And that is still the culture that prevails even in the high-level political forum. So we need both, all the processes and mechanisms in the UN should be speaking in one, to be consistent in mainstreaming or integrating particularly the human rights obligations and commitments of states in the SDGs, including in the monitoring and reporting, because it's not done. Many of the recommendations of the UN treaty bodies are related to advancing the SDGs. But these are not being reported on what progress has been done. The right to food, the right to health. For example, so this is just again to remind that there is an urgent need for an integrated approach to the SDGs, including within the UN, ensuring that the human rights is integrated to it. The third point is that the actions and measures needed to reach those left behind. That should not just be a slogan that we always hear. And yet, when countries report, or even other reports that are made, there is no data disaggregation to show, for example, that indigenous peoples are being left behind in terms of education, or the persons with disabilities are still not being employed, or women are still not participating in decision making. Unless we have data disaggregation in the way we do monitoring and reporting, including measures to reach those left behind, that will again just remain as a slogan. And finally, to add, how are we also addressing the impacts and consequences of the pandemic to the people that are left behind? That should be integral to the SDG plans of governments as we move, as we progress. And finally, part of this is, I mentioned already the need for the data disaggregation. But again, finally, is what are the measures that we are undertaking to really address the barriers and drivers of inequality and discrimination? We need to, for example, remove policies that are against human rights, that are, for example, in our case, that are criminalizing indigenous peoples instead of upholding our rights. So that is part of the policy coherence, but we need actions in relation to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. We're rapidly running out of time, but Mandeep, I want to turn to you briefly to tell us how do we build people-centered multilateralism, or how do we encourage and how can we push for greater participation and engagement of civil society in these processes?
So one thing I just would like to emphasize is that, Agenda 2030 is arguably the most ambitious agenda that we have as humanity have ever undertaken. And it's important that that when we focus on people-centered multilateralism and implementation of Agenda 2030, that we adopt a rights-based approach. And oftentimes there's a tendency to look at more economic discourses and to prioritize economic growth at the expense of rights. So that's important, that, when we look at issues, we look at things in a very holistic way. We can't have gender justice if we don't have rule of law. We can't reduce inequality if we don't have civil society partnerships. So it's important to focus on that. We can't protect biodiversity if we don't focus on sustainable production and consumption. So there's an interrelated element of that. And as you mentioned earlier, Ignacio, there's a tendency to cherry pick certain sustainable development goals by governments. They have their favorite goals, but all of these goals are interrelated. They are interdependent for a reason, just like the human rights discourse is interrelated and interdependent. So I think that's really, really important for us to keep in mind. But I do want to emphasize one important element, is the element of civil society partnerships and the element of civic space. The civil society organizations that are closest to communities, that work on issues of justice and equality and sustainability, are facing lots of challenges. Civil society organizations that are speaking truth to power, that are exposing collusion between elites, civil society organizations that are looking to protect minorities, are having to contend with very serious legislation that reduces their ability to operate. In many cases, activists that engage in peaceful acts of advocacy are being imprisoned unjustly, so through trials that are flawed. And here it's really important for us to focus on democratic values, and for the international community to come together and support civil society organizations and activists that promote justice and equality and peace.
Excellent, Mandeep. I think that's a good note to end on. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up here. But we've heard some very concrete and very grounded proposals for how to move forward with this agenda, not just at the conceptual and vision level, but at the practical level. And I hope these are recorded and acted on in the follow-up to this meeting. And just one final point I would make is that this session has focused on civil society and its perspective and or perspectives within civil society and actions within civil society. When we talk about partnerships, and there's a lot of talk about multi-stakeholder partnerships in the context of the SDGs, let's not paper over the fact that there are asymmetries of power between different actors operating in these spaces. When we talk about, how can governments, IFIs, the private sector, civil society, social movements, how can we all just work together and build this vision? That's nice, but you have to recognize that there were the power differentials and also the differentiated responsibilities of different actors. The private sector has a different role from the government in ensuring public goods, in delivering public services, and guaranteeing human rights. So I would say let's ensure that in going forward, the very practical difficulties that civil society groups are encountering, which our panelists have so eloquently talked about, are really taken into account going forward. Thank you very much to everyone. And to my three panelists, to Joan, Mandeep, and Shehnaz.
Thank you so much to all of you for an excellent panel discussion, which I can also see is acknowledged already in the chat. I'm sure you have sparked our imagination, and people are sitting with ideas that they want to contribute. So we have now opened for the next interactive segment. There's a link in the chat where we are asking for your input to answer two crucial questions. The first is, what urgent actions do we need to reduce vulnerabilities and ensure inclusion in sustainable recovery? That should have been just and sustainable recovery, I understand from Ignacio. But what urgent actions do we need? And the second question is, how do we build, develop, and protect the strong, inclusive, and accountable institutions we need for sustainable recovery? That, of course, is speaking to SDG 16. How do we ensure those institutions? As we're a little bit behind time, I will not try to recap the input right now, but just give the floor very briefly to Jim Fitzgerald, who is the Director for Equal Rights Trust, one of the co-sponsors of this event, to make some brief remarks before we move to the last panel. Please, Jim, can you speak for just 1 minute, please? Perhaps you're muted.
Thanks, Birgitte. Okay, I've lost 10 seconds unmuting myself. Look, from the perspective of the Equal Rights Trust and our network of partners who work at the front lines of the fight against discrimination every day around the world, what the pandemic has done and continues to do is to shine a harsh light on pre-existing patterns of inequality and discrimination, and the failure, the global failure of states to meet the commitments that they entered into in the UDHR in the 1940s, that they codified in the ICCPR and the ICSCR in the 1960s, and that they reiterated in the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. That is the commitment to eliminate discrimination and ensure equality of enjoyment of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And for us, there are three immediate things which states can do, should do, must do, and which derive directly from those obligations. The first is that they should undertake equality impact assessment of their policy responses to the pandemic and their policies as they move to recover. This is a consultative, preemptive, and data-driven process to identify and eliminate the discriminatory impacts of policy responses to the pandemic and the recovery. The second is they should adopt comprehensive and effective equality legislation and ensure its enforcement and implementation. And the third is that they should collect data disaggregated on all grounds recognized as grounds of discrimination at international law. These three things derive directly from the obligations in Article 2 of the ICCPR and the ICSCR. They're part of the international legal framework. They're tried and tested, but they're not fully and universally and uniformly implemented. And so, you know, of course, there's room for innovation. Of course, we should be looking at new and different solutions. But let's not forget that there are pre-existing mechanisms, part of the human rights architecture, which are long established, which have not been utilized, and which must be if states are to meet their basic obligations and if we're to have any hope of sustainable and just recovery. Thank you, Birgitte.
Thank you, Jim. I think we all acknowledge that the current situation reflects long overdue commitments and obligations under human rights law. So thank you for your contribution. While I encourage everybody to keep inputting into the questions so we can capture your ideas and recommendations, including for the report, we will now turn to the last panel, which will focus on how human rights mechanisms and institutions can guide and monitor sustainable recovery in practice. And I'm handing over to the competent hands of Mark Lyman, who is the Executive Director of the Universal Rights Group. And I will also encourage those of you who have questions to the panelists to ask these in the chat, and we will then convey those questions to Mark. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Birgitte. Hopefully you can hear me, and thank you to the Danish Institute, the permanent missions of Denmark and Chile, and all of the co-sponsors for pulling together this great event, which has really been fascinating so far. So hopefully we can continue that positive trend. So this last panel will try to grapple with the elephant in the room, the difficult question, which is the so what question. We've heard all of the things that governments and other actors should be doing, and governments themselves, of course, have not been quiet in terms of talking about how they're going to build back better, how they're going to take forward sustainable recovery. But there's a big difference between saying things and doing things. And so this panel will look at how can we, as in the international community, in particular, this panel will look at how can the human rights mechanisms and the national human rights institutions hold states, especially governments, if we're talking in the previous panel about power differentials, then really in this panel we're talking about states and governments. How can the mechanisms, special procedures, UPR, treaty bodies, and national human rights institutions hold governments to account to make sure that the words, the warm words, are put into practice and we do build back better and we don't just go back to business as usual? We'll start with a brief video presentation from Freddie Carrion from the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions before I will pose a couple of questions to colleagues from the Office of the High Commissioner and UNDP. And then, as Brigitte said, we will take some questions from the chat room, so please do put them forward. And I will pose those to the panelists, and we will do all of that in about 15 minutes. So first of all, the video, please. I think it's on mute.
Yes, I know why.
Dadas por los estados para hacer frente al COVID sean sostenibles. Un cordial saludo a todos los participantes del Laboratorio de Recuperación Sostenible y a las instituciones y organizaciones que han hecho posible este evento. Las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos cumplimos un rol fundamental en este proceso. Nuestro mandato nos obliga a monitorear y vigilar que las medidas adoptadas por los estados para hacer frente al COVID sean sostenibles, incluyentes, efectivas y transparentes, y que adicionalmente estén alineadas con los estándares internacionales de derechos humanos. Las INDH somos un mecanismo importante para exigir que los estados rindan cuentas sobre las acciones implementadas y sus resultados para garantizar los derechos humanos, pero también el cumplimiento de los ODS. Ese fue nuestro compromiso en el 2015 al adoptar la Declaración de Mérida sobre el papel de las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos en la ejecución de la Agenda 2030 para el Desarrollo Sostenible. Nuestro compromiso se vuelve más fuerte y tiene mayor vigencia en esta época de pandemia. Ante este difícil contexto, GANHRI ha desempeñado un rol protagónico, significativo, al brindar orientación y apoyo a todas las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos del mundo, ya sea promoviendo el intercambio de experiencias, recopilando sus buenas prácticas y experiencias en un estudio realizado con el apoyo de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos y del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo, PNUD, que será publicado próximamente. Durante este tiempo nos hemos dado cuenta de que la pandemia también es una oportunidad para reforzar la cooperación internacional y regional alrededor de una problemática que nos afecta a todos. Para terminar, quiero agradecer a cada uno de ustedes por su participación y a las instituciones y organizaciones que se han sumado a esta iniciativa. Les deseo una jornada productiva con excelentes resultados. Muchas gracias.
Many thanks to Dr. Freddie Carrion Entreago, from the chairperson of the Global Alliance of NHRIs, for his message. So now, as I said, I will ask a couple of very easy starter questions to our colleagues from OHCHR and UNDP. First of all, Ms. Marcela Favretto from OHCHR. Marcela, the Secretary-General's We Are All in This Together report, which focuses on the importance of human rights and the SDGs in building back better or sustainable recovery, has drawn considerable praise. But how can the UN promote state accountability vis-à-vis the principles and ideas contained in that report? And what is the role of the UN human rights mechanisms in that regard? You have 2 or 3 minutes, Marcela.
Exactly. So let me see how I can do justice to this question in 3 minutes. Can I focus on the role of the mechanism, because I feel like there's so much to say, and then, you know, of course, towards the end of my remarks I can expand, and especially because in 2020 the mechanism really stepped up their game to provide guidance, a wealth of guidance and country advice on the most pressing human rights challenges emerging from the pandemic, and with deliberate focus on disadvantaged groups, migrants, indigenous population, the poor, racial and ethnic minorities, in recognition of what has been underscored by other participants. No, the COVID has been an amplifier of pre-existing discrimination and inequalities. So for instance, there's a long list, and I invite all of you to sort of check on the website page, and this guidance has been used by states, civil society, to shape emergency responses and will be even more important in the recovery phase. So the treaty bodies have, for instance, detailed steps for protection of persons deprived of liberty in prisons, immigration detention centers. The special procedures have issued practical and punctual advice on stepping up access to health, housing. We heard from Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, the transition and the issue around social protection. We received very useful guidance on peaceful assembly and fundamental freedoms. So that's the first point. So that in terms of, how and what to do, in tackling the human rights challenges during the COVID-19, but then also a fundamental role for monitoring the impact or the disproportionate impacts of COVID and monitoring the government responses. So the special procedures alone have issued over 120 public statements and over 200 communications to states in 2020. But I think what is important to emphasize here is that the mechanism response to COVID-19 built on years of country-tailored policy advice on the very issues which are at the center of the discussion today on integrating human rights in sustainable development. So designing inclusive social protection scheme or tackling inequalities through more progressive taxation. And they've also warned on dangerous trends for human rights, which are sort of coming to the surface, particularly with COVID. So not treating rights as commodities, resourcing social spending, the dangers of deregulation and privatization of housing, water and sanitation, and calls for the IFIs not to factor states' human rights obligations, states' obligation on economic and social rights in their loans to states. And so all this is at the heart of sustainable recovery. And what is important, especially thinking of what Joan said in the previous panel about the big risk of, that this will be a business as usual phase instead of seeing the transformation. This is a capital, that we all have to sort of come out with solutions and sort of policies that can sort of bring the change we want to see. So these recommendations are part of, and this is my last point, are part of the compass we're using for our country engagement as OHCHR, which has been beefed up, of course, when it comes to protecting civil and political rights and addressing the undue restrictions that we have seen during the epidemic, but also sustainable recovery and rebuilding better has been a top priority. And we have this year, through the Surge initiative that has been mentioned by the ESG, hired economists who are helping us to advise states on how to sort of reshape, reset economies that work for everyone and deliver on rights. So reviews of public expenditure, for instance, so when it comes to food in the rural areas or health for particular sections of the population. This is something that, for instance, we've been doing in Colombia and Cameroon, or supporting fiscal policy reviews to ensure that taxation options do not become a burden for those who are already left behind. This is something that we've been looking at in Ecuador and Argentina, advising on inclusive social protection schemes, Ukraine, or a massive effort to support national human rights institutions, civil society and states in building disaggregated data sets Serbia on the Roma community, Kenya on the indigenous population. So just a sort of a snapshot of the kind of focus that we've tried to intensify. So to conclude, 2021 will be a tough year, will continue to be a tough year for rights. Not only we will have a risk of business as usual and missing the opportunity of rebooting our system, but also states will be likely under pressure for fiscal consolidation, austerity budgets. We will have the big issue of debt distress. So the key message here is that there's an important package of policy solutions which are well grounded and have been experimented in many country situations. So let's make the most of those policy solutions coming from the mechanism, and of course the issue of political resolve and leadership that is needed behind their implementation. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And congratulations, by the way. I think the role of special procedures and the High Commissioner in highlighting the human rights dimensions of COVID, the impacts of COVID, and then also response and recovery have been incredibly powerful and impressive. So hopefully that work will continue and you can hold states' feet to the fire to make sure they do build back better. Turning then to Sarah Rattray, who's Global Policy Specialist for Human Rights at UNDP. Sarah, welcome. The question for you is, what are UN country teams and resident coordinators doing to ensure the integration of human rights and the SDGs into national development planning at local level to make sure that indeed that states do go on the path towards sustainable recovery and not go back to business as usual? Sarah.
Thanks so much, Mark, and thanks to the Danish Institute for convening us this morning and all the previous speakers. It's been so enlightening. Yeah, it's a great question. The UN system has developed an initial framework for responding to COVID back last year, back in April, really focusing on sort of 5 different areas from a development system point of view. Access to healthcare, social protection, economic response, protection of jobs, social cohesion, various different streams based on a strong leave no one behind analysis as part of a mapping of those people most at risk of being left behind in COVID response. And that's been rolled out across the organisation. UNDP is co-leading this response at country level along with resident coordinators, but it's a UN system-wide effort. And as a consequence of that framework, lots of country teams around the world, I think there's been over 110 now, have done something called plans, socioeconomic plans to respond to COVID. And UNDP with OHCHR worked together to develop a tool, a checklist for a programming checklist for the human rights-based approach to COVID response for country teams globally. I put the link in the chat. And it's really an effort from us to support country teams to make sure that we're really using a human rights-based approach and that human rights is being integrated across the UN response. So there's part of that, and one of the cross-cutting elements of that is really looking at what has come out of the human rights mechanisms, because it's been, as Marcella said, incredibly impactful and useful, the wealth of information and data and recommendations that have come out of the human rights mechanisms, but also pre-existing recommendations that have been made over years in countries through the various processes, whether it's the UPR, treaty body recommendations, or visits of special procedures. We've done a review of all of these plans that have come out of the various UN country teams, and there's a lot of interesting ways in which UN country teams are using some of this information at country level. It is a mixed picture. But for instance, we see that in Bolivia and Jordan and some other countries, the previous recommendations from special procedures and previous country visits have been used when they're developing their plans for COVID response. The Universal Periodic Review process has been used and for analysing populations that are left behind and also looking at recommendations along substantive areas. 85% of these plans at country level are also looking at structural drivers of exclusion and discrimination in laws. But we don't see that being taken a step forward consistently to look at root causes, for instance. A couple of other areas that are very critical is engagement with civil society, and the role of national human rights institutions has been really highlighted by the previous video, but throughout the actions that they've been taking in over 90 countries are quite incredible to highlight the rights dimensions of COVID and how states can support to respond better. So these plans are quite critical, and I'll just take 30 seconds to say about what's happening now with these plans is that they are being reviewed, and then they'll be looked at in terms of these future cooperation frameworks that the UN has at country level. So hopefully this wealth of data and this lens that's been used through these plans will also, of course, lead on to longer term engagement from the UN at country level. And the Leave No One Behind framing, this mapping of people at risk, looking at potential adverse impacts of COVID in terms of inequalities and discrimination, how to address these and how to ensure we're not backsliding on the SDGs is really critical moving ahead. And I think the work of the human rights mechanisms has been very important in terms of framing and how we can move ahead. I put in the chat some of these tools that certainly UNDP has developed in order to make sure that these policy recommendations are critical in our efforts to support building forward better, but I know it's being utilised more broadly across the system.
Thank you, Sarah, and apologies that we were a bit rushed. We've actually run out of time already. I received just one question from the chat room, which I will try and answer just in my wrapping up, which was a question of how concretely can states demonstrate their commitment to building back better and not going back to business as usual. What steps might they take? And just to say very quickly on that there's been a little bit of chatter over the past week or so in Geneva about the possibility of states discussing, agreeing, and perhaps signing some kind of pledge. Not a pledge that would reinvent the wheel, but a pledge that would take all of the different relevant UN reports, of course, human rights obligations, the SDG commitments, and package it into a document that states could therefore pledge to work towards building back better and sustainable recovery across all three dimensions of sustainable development, so the economic, the social, and the environmental. So that's one concrete idea. And with that, I will pass back to Birgitte, who's probably very stressed because we've gone slightly over time. Birgitte, my apologies for that, but I pass the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And it's correct, we have already reached the finishing line, and I think we have to take this as an appetizer to a much longer continuous dialogue that we need to have. I have given up on trying to summarize because we're out of time, but also because this was so rich and dense in terms of insights, experiences, tools, recommendations, etc. We have two things before we are done. One, we will pose a question in the chat where we will ask for your specific recommendations on what should be the next step to push this agenda on sustainable recovery through the Human Rights Council, the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And I will also very briefly give the floor to Søren Høsbro Larsen from the Permanent Mission of Denmark to the UN in Geneva to share his reflections on the event and the recommendations that have come up. So over to you for just a minute, Søren.
Thank you very much, Birgitte. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, just briefly wanted to reflect and really to underline also from Denmark's side again, as my ambassador said in the beginning, that we really must build back better and greener. And Denmark is committed to ensuring that human rights and democracy, the rule of law, and gender equality really are at the center of the immediate and the long-term global response and our recovery. And the idea of a pledge is really intriguing, and I think we would definitely be very interested in working on that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Søren, for this very encouraging message from Denmark. As I said, I will not try to summarize, but I think there's one message that stands very clearly, and that is that we were not on track to realize the SDGs. So we should not get back on track. We need to work on the long overdue obligations under the human rights framework and the long overdue commitments under the 2030 agenda. And I think all speakers here have pointed to the transformational vision that was underlying the 2030 agenda that we need to resume in a just, fair and sustainable recovery across the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. I also think that the idea of uniting us and taking a whole of government, whole of society approach is well reflected in perhaps a pledge or another mechanism which can give me the hope that this event was indeed the beginning and not the end of a discussion. We will try to capture all the key elements, messages and brilliant ideas and circulate a report very briefly. So let me just conclude by thanking all of you who spent your time together with us this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where on the globe you are. And let me also thank all the co-sponsors who came together and supported this event. I look very much forward to the continuation of our discussion. Thank you so much.